This film begins by showing a guy named Johnny Black coming to a small town to track down the gang leader who murdered his dad. But before he goes on with his search, he decides to take a break at a bar. While he's there, he sees these two young guys and a girl from an indigenous tribe getting picked on by some local bullies. Johnny feels bad for them, so he leaves the bar and takes on the bullies one by one, giving them a good beating until they can't fight back anymore. But an old sheriff sneaks up behind Johnny and makes him point his gun at him. Johnny doesn't want to hurt the sheriff, but he's caught off guard and he ends up shooting the sheriff's hat. Unfortunately, because the sheriff is pretty old, this shock gives him a heart attack and he dies right there. Now the people in the town see Johnny with a gun and think he killed the sheriff, so they all start aiming their guns at him. And a bunch of bounty hunters, led by this guy Bill Bassett, show up and arrest Johnny. After a while, Bill and his gang throw Johnny into jail to claim the reward for catching him. Johnny is a wanted criminal, and the law wants to catch him. Inside the jail, Johnny spots a poster of Brett Claytoon, the guy who killed his dad, and is now the most wanted criminal in the whole country. There's a big reward for whoever catches Brett. Switching to Johnny's past 25 years ago. Back then, as a teenager, Johnny used to hang out with his dad, Bullseye Black, who was famous for his sharpshooting skills. They would put on shooting shows for the people in town. Johnny learned a lot from his dad and became a great shooter himself at a young age. But Brett, the guy who leads the gang, didn't like that Bullseye, who was African American, was getting all this attention. So, one day, Brett and his gang robbed a bank nearby and not only took a bunch of money, but also killed all the bank workers. In the evening, Bullseye, who also worked as a priest, he was talking to his people about a bank robbery that happened the day before. He told them to forgive the people who did wrong, even the robbers, and not to keep anger in their hearts. After his talk, Brett and his gang came to the church. They wanted to have a quick draw shootout with Bullseye. At first, Bullseye refused because he was a priest, but Brett didn't give up, so Bullseye finally agreed. They started the duel, but Bullseye didn't grab his gun. Instead, he held up his Bible and asked Brett to change his ways. Sadly, Brett didn't listen and shot Bullseye right there. Johnny, who saw his dad get shot, was filled with anger and resolved to avenge his father's death by going after Brett. Returning to the present, Johnny had been found guilty of his actions, which were deemed responsible for the sheriff's death, and they were about to hang him in the town square. But then two indigenous Indian teenagers, who Johnny had helped earlier, saved him. They shot the rope and took Johnny away. They went to an indigenous Indian village, and a boy named Adriel thanked Johnny and asked him to stay with their tribe. Johnny declined because he wanted to find Brett and get even for what he did to his dad. So he said goodbye and rode away on a horse. As Johnny was heading to another town, he got surprised by a guy named Bill and his buddies. They wanted to catch Johnny, but he was clever. He set up some dynamite traps to stop them from following him. After Johnny managed to dodge those bounty hunters, he kept on traveling across the grasslands. But he hit a rough patch and got tired and thirsty after days without water. He couldn't take it anymore and passed out. Luckily, a priest named Reverend Percy saved him. When Johnny woke up that night, Percy asked why he was on this solo journey. Johnny admitted that he was out to get revenge on a gangster leader. Percy tried to talk some sense into him, saying revenge wasn't the right path. But Johnny didn't really pay much attention to Percy's advice, even though he just saved his life. Soon after, Percy showed Johnny a picture of a girl named Bessie and explained that he was on a journey to meet her in Hope Springs City. They'd been writing letters to each other, and Percy wanted to become a priest there too. The next day, out of nowhere, an indigenous Indian tribe attacked them. Percy got hit by an arrow and passed out. Johnny figured Percy might not make it, so he decided to leave him behind and keep going using Percy's wagon. Before Johnny rolled into Hope Springs City, he shaved his beard on purpose. He wanted to look like Percy to sneak into the city easily. When he got to a bar, he met Bessie, and she recognized him as the priest from the letters. She invited him over to her place. But the cops at the bar thought Johnny was a fake priest. Thankfully, Bessie managed to convince them that he was the priest sent to their town. Meanwhile, Percy was still alive and was being set up for a wedding with the chief's daughter, who was pretty strong. Percy tried to make a run for it from that situation. That night, the people in town found out that Johnny was the new priest and gave him a warm welcome at the church. They were excited to hear his preaching on Sunday. But Johnny had no idea how to give a preaching, so he was thinking about leaving town before Sunday came. After everyone left, a church person came up to Johnny and gave him a key to a safe with the church members' money. They said it was in the bank, and Johnny could check it on Monday. So Johnny decided to stick around until Monday to grab the money. On Saturday morning, Percy finally escaped from the indigenous Indian tribe and avoided that arranged marriage with the chief's daughter. Meanwhile, Johnny, who had just finished taking a bath, was tempted by Bessie to spend the night with her. But he declined because he was planning to leave Hope Springs. Around the same time, a troublemaker named Bob was making a scene near the church. He was scaring the townspeople because he was working for some official who wanted to buy the church's land, but the townspeople had rejected his offer. Johnny saw the commotion and left the church to have a shootout with Bob. He shot Bob down in 2 shots. Soon after, Jessie, a woman from the respected Jessie family, who was known for helping the people in Hope Springs, showed up to see what was going on with Bob. Johnny introduced himself to Jessie and was taken by her beauty. Jessie, who happened to be Bessie's older sister, thanked Johnny for stopping Bob and told him about the official who wanted to buy the church's land. As they were talking, suddenly Percy showed up, wearing traditional indigenous Indian clothes. He looked tired and said he was sent to be a priest in Hope Springs. Percy was pretty upset with Johnny for leaving him behind, which led to him getting caught by the indigenous Indian tribe. When the townspeople heard Percy's story, they thought he was a bit crazy because of his ragged clothes. They even took him to a horse stable. Once things calmed down, Johnny went over to Percy and asked him to act like a church worker who had worked with him before. Johnny had been telling everyone that he was Percy. He explained that they needed to keep up this act until Monday when he planned to leave town. Johnny made it clear that if Percy didn't agree, he might have to use force. Meanwhile, an official named Tom Sheely was frustrated because his plan to send Bob to mess with the church hadn't worked. So he and his henchmen were thinking of another way to buy the church's land, even if it meant paying a lot for it. Back to Johnny, he took Percy to the church to show everyone that he had cured Percy of his craziness, and everyone was impressed. That night, while Johnny and Percy were chatting in the priest room, Johnny accidentally knocked over an ink box and found a rolled-up piece of paper. It turned out to be a treasure map that the previous priest had kept secret. From the map, Johnny realized there was treasure hidden behind the church. He asked Percy to rest while he went to check it out in the backyard of the church. When Johnny went to the back of the church, he found out there was an oil well back there. That's why that officials wanted to buy the land so he could control the oil well. Out of the blue, Jessie showed up and asked Johnny what he was up to. He made up a story about inspecting the church area. He also told her he had feelings for her, and it turned out she felt the same way. Meanwhile, Bessie sneaked into Johnny's room to sleep with him, thinking it was Johnny. But she didn't realize it was actually Percy. Percy didn't say anything and went along with it since he liked Bessie. After Bessie left the room, Johnny came back and was surprised when he smelled women's perfume and saw Percy looking all happy. The next morning, Johnny asked Percy to give the preaching because he pretended to have lost his voice. Percy happily agreed and left the room. Right after, Bessie came in and hugged Johnny, asking if he had a good time the night before. Johnny was pretty shocked and let go of her quickly, not sure what she was up to. When all the people gathered at the church, Percy said he'd be giving the preaching because Johnny had lost his voice. At the same time, Johnny smelled his hand and realized the perfume on Bessie was the same as the one in his room from the night before. He called out Percy, who had been with Bessie, not realizing he was speaking loudly in front of everyone. Percy said Johnny's voice was back, so Johnny reluctantly had to give the preaching. He remembered his dad's preaching about forgiving and letting go of anger, so he talked about that to the people. After Johnny finished the preaching session, he went back to his room and was pretty surprised to see Jessie and Bessie there. Both of them seemed upset with him, thinking that he had fooled around with Bessie and flirted with Jessie. Meanwhile, Tom was getting frustrated because the townspeople still hadn't sold the church's land. He told his henchmen to spread the word that he'd hire the tough Rough Riders gang if the townspeople didn't agree to sell the land. Now, back to Johnny at the bar. It looked like he was trying to get Percy to confess that he was the one who slept with Bessie. But Percy was drunk and started talking nonsense, causing a ruckus in the bar. He even tried to attack Johnny but missed and hit another drunk guy instead. Johnny decided to leave the bar and meet up with Jessie to show her the treasure map he had found. He explained to her that Tom wanted to control the oil well behind the church. It was during this conversation that Johnny revealed he was actually a wanted criminal, and the real priest for Hope Springs was Percy. After sharing this, Johnny said his goodbyes to Jessie and continued his journey to another town. On a different day, Jessie told the townspeople about the oil well map Johnny had given her the night before. Percy, who had found the map on Saturday night, explained that Johnny had left the room right after. This surprised Bessie, who asked who was in Johnny's room that night. Percy finally explained everything, making Bessie and her sister realize that Percy was the one who had really been with Bessie before. Jessie tried to move past the issue by urging everyone in Hope Springs to keep the church land so they could use the oil well for the town's benefit. While they were still talking, 2 police officers arrived and told them that Tom was going to hire the ruthless Rough Rider gang to force them out. This news made the people of Hope Springs panic because the Rough Riders were known to be very mean. On the other hand, Percy confessed to Bessie that he was the one who had been exchanging letters with her. To convince her, Percy read some poems he had written for her, and she finally accepted him. That night, Johnny got caught by Bill and his gang and was taken back to Hope Springs. Bill wasted no time and threw Johnny into jail, planning to execute him the next day. While Johnny was locked up, Percy, who said he was a priest, paid him a visit and gave him a Bible. Percy also said his goodbyes and mentioned he was going to see the indigenous Indian tribe that had held him captive before. The next day, Johnny read the Bible Percy had given him and found a hidden key inside it. Johnny used the key to escape from his cell and then tricked Bill's henchmen, who were relaxing and playing cards, and easily beat them. Johnny, who had a plan. He went after Tom, who was in Hope Springs, and took Jessie as a hostage. He wanted her to sign a document giving up the church land and to convince everyone to leave town after signing it because he had hired the tough Rough Rider gang. Despite being held hostage, Jessie refused to sign the document, even though she knew the Rough Riders were really scary. At the same time, the Rough Rider gang, led by Brett, was on their way to Hope Springs on Tom's orders. Back to Tom. He got a surprise visit from a police officer named Clancy, who challenged Tom to a shootout. Tom's henchmen laughed it off, not realizing that Clancy was actually working with Johnny to distract Tom and his gang while they rescued Jessie. After Jessie was safe, Johnny took out all of Tom's henchmen from behind. A little later, the Rough Rider gang entered Hope Springs, ready to cause trouble. The townspeople were armed and ready, and when Johnny and Jessie showed up, Johnny talked to Brett, the gang's leader. He told Brett that even though he had a grudge, he was willing to forgive and asked the gang to leave town. Brett refused, especially because he thought his gang was stronger. But out of the blue, Bill and his gang arrived to back up Johnny. Percy also came with the indigenous Indian tribe to help, and even the drunk people from the bar were ready to join the fight against the gangsters. At the same time, Tom, who had been captured, tried to secretly shoot Johnny, but Adriel quickly saved Johnny with his bow and arrow. A battle with the Rough Rider gang finally ensued. Johnny faced off with Brett, and when Brett challenged him to a shootout, Johnny surprised him by pulling out a Bible, just like his dad had done years ago. That made Brett realize that Johnny was the son of Bullseye, the guy he had killed a long time ago. With Brett still in shock, Johnny pulled out his hidden gun behind the Bible and took down the leader of the Rough Rider gang. In the end, everyone in town thought of Johnny as a hero, and they made him the sheriff of Hope Springs. As for Bill, he had his sights set on Brett's head, which was worth a lot to the government. But just then, Johnny said that the townspeople would take care of the oil well, and he announced that he was marrying Jessie. The moral lesson from the story is never underestimate the value of a good book, because it might save your life in a gunfight. And always remember, forgiveness can even turn the fiercest enemies into friends.